It's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon. This is a man I've long admired, and a man who's admired by many Catholics and non-Catholics in this country and around the world. Charles Chaput was born in Kansas in 1944. He joined the Capuchin Franciscans in 1965 and was ordained a priest in 1970. In 1988, he was named Bishop of Rapid City, South Dakota by Pope John Paul II, and in 1997, Archbishop of Denver, Colorado, a position that he holds today. Archbishop Chaput holds graduate degrees in theology and religious education. He is a Native American by birth, the first Catholic bishop of Native American ancestry, and a member of the prairie band Potawatomi tribe. You know, I worked on that and I just blew it. The rest of this I'm going to get right, though. From 2003 to 2006, he served as a White House appointed commissioner with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, a tenure that included fact-finding trips to China and Turkey. In 2005, he served on the official U.S. delegation to the Cordoba Conference on Anti-Semitism and other forms of intolerance, sponsored by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Archbishop Chaput is the author of Living the Catholic Faith, Rediscovering the Basics, and most recently, Render unto Caesar, Serving the Nation by Living Our Catholic Beliefs in Political Life. In Render unto Caesar, the Archbishop has the following to say, and I quote, "Catholic teaching often has political side effects because it has public implications. In every age, Christians have faced a new version of the same dilemma. They need to act fruitfully in the world without being absorbed by it. They need to love the world because God loves it and seeks its salvation. The dynamic tension in Christian life comes from the two great commandments. We should love God above everything else. And because of that, we should love the people He created as we love ourselves. We must seek God first, but we can't reach Him without living lives of justice and mercy here and now." Unquote. Because of these commandments, he goes on to argue in his book, Catholics cannot treat their faith as a purely private matter. They must live in the world, and standing with others of goodwill, Catholics and non-Catholics, believers and non-believers, transform the world for the better. Archbishop Chaput is a humble man with a powerful voice. I'm honored to welcome him to Georgetown and to this podium. Thank you, Archbishop.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. I'm grateful to Mr. Farr for the invitation and to the Berkeley Center for the important work it's doing. The issue of religious liberty is so very, very important for our times, and I think for all times. I'm going to stick closely with my text because I think it's important to be precise. It's entitled Subject to the Governor of the Universe, the American Experience, and Global Religious Liberty. A friend once said, and I think shrewdly, that if people want to understand the United States, they need to read two documents. Neither one is the Declaration of Independence, neither one is the Constitution. In fact, neither one has anything obviously to do with politics. The first document is John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. The second is Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Celestial Railroad. Bunyan's book is one of history's great religious allegories. It's also deeply Christian. It embodies the Puritan Protestant hunger for God that drove America's first colonists and shaped the roots of our country. Hawthorne's short story, of course, is a very different piece. It's one of the great satires of American literature. A descendant of Puritans himself, Hawthorne takes Bunyan's allegory, man's difficult journey towards heaven, and retells it through the lens of American hypocrisy, our appetite for comfort, easy answers, quick fixes, material success, and phony religious piety. Bunyan and Hawthorne lived on different continents 200 years apart. But the two men did share one thing. Both men, the believer and the skeptic, lived in a world profoundly shaped by Christian thought, faith, and language. The same moral space that incubated the United States. And that has implications for our discussion today. In his World Day of Peace message earlier this year, Pope Benedict XVI voiced his concern over the worldwide prevalence of what he's referred to as, quote, persecution, discrimination, terrible acts of violence, and religious intolerance, end of quote. In reality, we now face a global crisis in religious liberty. As a Catholic bishop, I have a natural concern that Christian minorities in Africa and Asia bear the brunt of today's religious discrimination and violence. Benedict noted the same fact in his own remarks. But Christians are not the only victims. Data from the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life are sobering. Nearly 70% of the world's people now live in nations, regrettably, many of them Muslim majority countries, as well as China and North Korea, where religious freedom is gravely restricted, 70%. Principles that Americans find self-evident, the dignity of the human person, the sanctity of conscience, the separation of political and sacred authority, the distinction between secular and religious law, the idea of a civil society pre-existing and distinct from the state, are not widely shared elsewhere. In fact, as Leszek Kolakowski once said, what seemed self-evident to the American founders, quote, would appear either patently false or meaningless and superstitious to most of the great men that keep shaping our political imagination, end of quote. We need to ask ourselves, why is this the case? We also need to ask ourselves why we Americans seem to be so complacent about our own freedoms. In fact, nothing guarantees that America's experiment in religious freedom, as we traditionally know it, will survive here in the United States, let alone serve as a model for other countries in the future. The Constitution is a great achievement in ordered liberty, but it's just another elegant scrap of paper unless people keep it alive with their convictions and their living witness. Yet in government, media, academia, in the business community, and in the wider culture, many of our leaders no longer seem to regard religious faith as a healthy or positive social factor. We can sense this in the current administration's ambivalence toward the widespread violations of religious liberty across the globe. We can see it in the inadequacy or disinterest of many of our news media in reporting on religious freedom issues. And we can see it especially in the indifference of many ordinary American citizens. In that light, I have 4 points that I'd like to share with you today. They're more in the nature of personal thoughts than conclusive arguments, but they emerge from my years as a commissioner with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and I believe they're true, and they need to be said. The first 3 deal with the American experience. The last one deals with whether and how the American experience can apply internationally. Here's my first point. The American model of religious liberty is rooted in the thought world and idea architecture of the Christian humanist tradition. We cannot understand the framework of American institutions or the values that these institutions are meant to promote and defend if we don't acknowledge that they grow out of a predominantly Christian worldview. Obviously, our laws and public institutions also reflect Jewish scripture, Roman Republican thought and practice, and the Enlightenment's rationalist traditions. But as Crane Britton once observed with some irony, quote, even the Enlightenment itself is a child of Christianity, which may explain for our Freudian times why the Enlightenment was also hostile to Christianity, end of quote. Whatever it becomes in the future, America was born Protestant, and foreign observers often seem to understand that better than we do. As many of you know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German Lutheran scholar and pastor murdered by the Third Reich, taught for a time in New York City in the 1930s. He came away struck by the differences between the American and French revolutionary traditions and the Christian character of American ideas. Bonhoeffer said, quote, American democracy is not founded upon the emancipated man, but quite on the contrary, upon the kingdom of God, and the limitation of all earthly powers by the sovereignty of God, end of quote. As Bonhoeffer saw it, the American system of checks and balances, which emphasizes personal responsibility and limited government, reflects fundamental biblical truths about original sin, the appetite for power, and human weakness. Jacques Maritain, the French Catholic scholar who helped draft the UN's Charter on Human Rights, said much the same. He called our Declaration of Independence, quote, an outstanding lay Christian document tinged with the philosophy of the day, end of quote. He also said, quote, the American founding fathers were neither metaphysicians nor theologians, but their philosophy of life and their political philosophy, their notion of natural law and human rights, were permeated by concepts worked out by Christian reason and backed up by an unshakable religious feeling, end of quote. That's my point. At the heart of the American model of public life is a Christian vision of man, government, and God. Now, I want to be clear about what I'm saying here and what I'm also not saying. I'm not saying that America is a Christian nation. Nearly 80% of our people self-describe themselves as Christians, and many millions of them actively practice their faith. But we never have been and never will be a Christian confessional state. I'm also not saying that our Protestant heritage is uniformly good. Some of the results are clearly good, very good. America's culture of personal opportunity, respect for the individual, a tradition of religious liberty and freedom of speech, and a reverence for the law. Other effects of Reformation theology have been less happy. Radical individualism, revivalist politics, a Calvinist hunger for material success as proof of salvation, an ugly nativist and anti-Catholic streak, a tendency towards intellectual shallowness and disinterest in matters of creed, and a nearly religious and sometimes dangerous sense of national destiny and redemptive mission. None of these sins, however, and yes, some of our nation's sins have led to very bitter suffering both here and abroad, take away from the genius of the American model. This model has given us a free, open, and non-sectarian society marked by an astonishing variety of cultural and religious expressions. But our system's success does not result from the procedural mechanisms our founders put in place. Our system works precisely because of the moral assumptions that undergird it. And those moral assumptions have a religious grounding. That brings me to my second point. At the heart of the American model of religious liberty is a Christian vision of the sanctity and destiny of the human person. The great Jesuit scholar, Father John Courtney Murray, stressed, quote, the American Bill of Rights is not a piece of 18th century rationalist theory. It is far more the product of Christian history. Behind it, one can see not the philosophy of the Enlightenment, but the older philosophy that had been the matrix of the common law. The man whose rights are guaranteed in the face of law and government is, whether he knows it or not, the Christian man, who had learned to know his dignity in the school of Christian faith. End of quote. I believe that's true. It's a crucial insight, and it's confirmed by other scholarship, including Harold Berman's outstanding work in the history of Western law and his study of religious liberty and America's founding. My point here is that the institutions and laws in which we call the Western world presume a Christian anthropology, a Christian definition of the meaning of life. In the American model, the human person is not a product of nature or evolution. He is not a creature of the state or the economy, nor, for that matter, is he the slave of an impersonal heaven. Man is first and fundamentally a religious being with intrinsic worth, a free will, and inalienable rights. He is created in the image of God, by God, and for God. Because we are born of God, we belong to God, and any claims that Caesar may make on us, while important, are secondary. In the vision of America's founders, God endows each of us with spiritual freedom and inherent rights so that we can fulfill our duties towards Him and each other. Our rights come from God, not from the state. Government is justified only insofar as it secures those natural rights, promotes them, and defends them. And this is not just the curious view of some religious shaman. Nearly all the men who drew up our founding documents held this same belief. Note what James Madison said in his Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments in 1785. This is the quote. "Man's duty of honoring God is precedent, both in order of time and degree of obligation, to the claims of civil society. Before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe." End of quote. That is why religious freedom is humanity's first and most important freedom. Our first governor is God, our Creator, the governor of the universe. We are created for a religious purpose. We have a religious destiny. Our right to pursue this destiny precedes the state. Any attempt to suppress our right to worship, preach, teach, practice, organize, and peacefully engage society because of our belief in God is an attack not only on the cornerstone of human dignity, but also on the identity of the American experiment. I want to add one more thing here. The men who bequeathed us the American system, including the many Christians among them, had a legion of blind spots. Some of those flaws were brutally ugly. Slavery, exploitation of the native peoples, greed, and ethnic and religious bigotry, including a crude anti-Catholicism that remains the most vivid religious prejudice in this country that this country has ever indulged. But the American logic of a society based on God's sovereignty and the sanctity of the human person has also proven itself remarkably capable of self-criticism, repentance, reform, and renewal. And this brings me to my third point. In the American model, religion is more than a private affair between the individual believer and God. Religion is essential to the virtues needed for a free people. Religious groups are expected to make vital contributions to the nation's social fabric. For all their differences, Americans' founders agreed that a free people cannot remain free and self-governing without religious faith and the virtues that it fosters. John Adams' famous words to the Massachusetts militia in 1789 were typical. Here's the quote. "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other kind." End of quote. When the founders talked about religion, they meant something more demanding and vigorous than a vague spirituality that's vague today, that's in vogue today. Harold Berman showed that the founders understood religion in a frankly Christian-informed sense. Religion meant, quote, both belief in God and belief in an afterlife, a reward for virtue and punishment for sin, end of quote. In other words, religion mattered, personally and socially. It was more than a private preference. It made people live differently. People's faith was assumed to have broad implications, including the political kind. From the beginning, believers, alone and in communities, have shaped American history simply by trying to live their faith in the world. As Nathaniel Hawthorne saw so well, too many of us do it badly, with ignorance and hypocrisy. But enough believers in every generation have done it well enough, long enough, to keep the animating spirit of our country's experiment in ordered liberty alive. Or to put it in another way, the American experience of personal freedom and civil peace is inconceivable without a religious grounding, and specifically Christian inspiration. What we believe about God shapes what we believe about man, and what we believe about man shapes what we believe about the purpose and proper structure of human society. The differences among Christian, atheist, Hindu, Jewish, and Muslim thought are not insurmountable, but they are also not incidental. Faith, sincerely believed or sincerely refused, has consequences. As a result, theology and anthropology have serious long-term social and political implications. And papering those differences over with a veneer of secular pieties does not ensure civil peace. It ensures conflict, because religious faith touches on the most fundamental elements of human identity and destiny, and its expression demands a public space. This brings me to my fourth and final point. I believe that the American model does work, and that its principles can and should be adapted by other countries. But with this caveat: the Christian roots of our ideals have implications. It's impossible to talk honestly about the American model of religious freedom without acknowledging that it is, to a significant degree, the product of Christian-influenced thought. Dropping this model on non-Christian cultures, as our country learned from bitter experience in Iraq, becomes a very dangerous exercise. One of the gravest mistakes of American policy in Iraq was to overestimate the appeal of Washington-style secularity and to underestimate the power of religious faith in shaping culture and politics. Nonetheless, I do believe that the values enshrined in the American model touch the human heart universally. We see that in the democracy movements now sweeping the Middle East and North Africa. The desire for freedom and human dignity live in all human beings. These yearnings are not culturally conditioned or the result of imposed American or Western ideals. They're inherent to us all. The modern world system of international law is founded on this assumption of universal values shared by people of all cultures, ethnicities, and religions. The Spanish Dominican priest Francisco de Vitoria in the 16th century envisioned something like the United Nations. An international rule of law is possible, he said, because there is a natural law inscribed in the heart of every person, a set of values that are universal, objective, and do not change. John Courtney Murray argued in the same way. The natural law of tradition presumes that men and women are religious by nature. It presumes that we are born with an innate desire for transcendence and truth. These assumptions are the core of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Many of the people who worked on that declaration, like Jacques Maritain, believed that this charter of international liberty reflected the American experience. Article 18 of the Declaration famously says, quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance." End of quote. In a sense, then, the American model has already been applied. What we see today is a repudiation of that model by atheist regimes and secular ideologies, and also, unfortunately, by militant versions of some non-Christian religions. The global situation is made worse by the inaction of our own national leadership in promoting to the world one of America's greatest qualities, religious freedom. This is regrettable because we urgently need an honest discussion of the relationship between Islam and the assumptions of the modern democratic state. In diplomacy and international dialogue, we need to encourage an Islamic public theology that is both faithful to Muslim traditions and also open to liberal norms. Sharia law is not a solution. Christians living under Sharia uniformly experience it as offensive, discriminatory, and a grave violation of their human dignity. A healthy distinction between the sacred and the secular, between religious law and civil law, is foundational to free societies. Christians, and especially Catholics, have learned the hard way that the marriage of church and state rarely works. For one thing, religion usually ends up the loser, an ornament, or a house chaplain for Caesar. For another, all theocracies are utopian, and every utopia ends up persecuting or murdering the dissenters who can't or won't pay allegiance to its claims of universal bliss. I began this talk with John Bunyan for a reason. To this day, his major work, The Pilgrim's Progress, is the second most widely read book in the Western world, next only to the Bible. But the same Puritan spirit that created such beauty and genius in Bunyan also led to Oliver Cromwell, the Salem witch trials, and the theocratic repression of other Protestants and, of course, Catholics. Americans have learned from their own past. The genius of the American founding documents is the balance they achieve in creating a civic life that is non-sectarian and open to all, but also dependent for its survival on the mutual respect of secular and sacred authority. The system works. That's why we like living in this country. We should take pride in it as one of the historic contributions this country has made to the moral development of peoples worldwide. We need to insist that religious freedom, a person's right to freely worship, preach, teach, and practice what he or she believes, including the right to freely change or end one's religious beliefs under the protection of law, is a foundation stone of human dignity. No one, whether acting in the name of God or in the name of some political agenda or ideology, has the authority to interfere with that basic human right. This is a promise of the American model. The founders of this country, most of them Christian, sought no privileges for their kind. They would not force others to believe what they believed. Heretics would not be punished. They knew that the freedom to believe must include the freedom to change one believes or to stop believing altogether. Our founders did not lack conviction, just the opposite. They had enormous confidence in the power of their own reason, but also in the sovereignty of God and God's care for the destiny of every soul. America was born, in James Madison's words, to be, quote, an asylum to the persecuted and oppressed of every nation and religion. Right now in America, we're not acting like we revere that legacy or want to share it or really even understand it. And I think we may awake one day to see that as a tragedy for ourselves and too many others to count. Thank you for your time and attention. Appreciate it. Sure.
Well, thank you very much, Archbishop Chaput, for that steering and stirring address. I'm tempted to ask a number of questions myself, but I'm going to forego the privilege because I know that there will be questions in the audience. So, and we're a little bit behind today. I'm going to get us back on. So let's if you would look to the ladies who have the microphones, raise your hands and identify yourselves and ask your questions.
Marshall Brieger.
I can't see.
I teach at the Catholic University in Washington. I want to thank Your Eminence for as Tom Frost said, stirring and I think very incisive speech. But I do have one question. I have no doubt that the founders and the founding documents were based on a Christian anthropology. I might quibble whether it was a Protestant anthropology or a Catholic, or at least whether, I'm not an expert, so whether there were significant differences between that. But I think the real question today is, can one honestly, or even if it's not today, let's say 50 years from now, can one say that we are still a Christian country? That that anthropology that animated the founders is relevant in the lives and cadences of the people. And if it isn't, then you have a problem. You have a document that doesn't relate to the sociology of the population. And I mean, certainly the Pope has suggested that Europe is no longer Christian, he's re-evangelizing. Now, all I'm asking is, can we expect to say that we should use the Christian character of the founding, in the broad sense, in our present discussions if our population no longer is responsive to that? Now, maybe they are today. Will they be 50 years? I'm not sure what the Pew future polls will show. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. As I said in my talk, I don't think our country is a Christian country, but its founding documents are based on Christian thought, and it's important for us historically to acknowledge that and to revere it, even if we don't happen to be believers. I think there's plenty of room in this country for people who don't believe what Christians believe in terms of our foundational principles of our faith. But I think if we dismiss the principles behind our founding and don't acknowledge the importance of those principles, there's a chance that what we believe about our country, about religious freedom, can collapse. Because it isn't just born as a principle, it's born from a way of thinking. And I think that even if we don't share Christian faith completely, the understanding of human nature that our Constitution is founded on is very important for us to cherish and embrace. So I don't think we have to be an expressly confessing Christian people to love our Constitution and to think about human beings and human dignity and human freedom as the Christian tradition leads us to think. Of course, there's no Christianity without Judaism, so it has its roots there too.
We have a question down front here.
Hello, Ken Masugi, Johns Hopkins. One can add a third thinker to the two you mentioned earlier, and that's Tocqueville, who thought that religion was foundational for American democracy, but he also foresaw an extraordinary skepticism that would dissolve the hold of religion on Americans. And he suggests that there are some alternatives. But I'm wondering, is it only through reinforced faith that we can hold up a religion as a pillar of democracy, or are there other ways of doing this?
Well, I think it would all depend on whether or not you can think that you can maintain a commitment to human dignity and the values that underlie our Constitution without being women and men of faith. I personally think it's very, very difficult, but others would argue that there are principles that stand intelligently together on their own without the personal commitment that's required by faith. I think that's possible. But I also think it's the indifference we sometimes have today in our country towards those towards our foundation and those thought processes and values is dangerous for us. And I think there isn't a difference in hearts and minds of many people today towards religious freedom. They don't think. I think it's just it's kind of a nice thought, but it's not essential to who we are. Is a sign of impending collapse if we don't value religious freedom, which I think I tried to say is the foundational freedom of our country. Then the rest of it could collapse. So I know many people who love the principles of on which our country is based who are not professing Christians.
Okay, we have one over here, but
It's hard for me to be a good person without being a profession. I don't claim that I'm good, but to be as good as I am, it's difficult without being a believer. So I don't know how it's hard to succeed without being a believer. That's maybe my personal weakness shining through.
Thank you. Name's Michael Fisher. I'm an undergraduate here at Georgetown, actually from Denver, Colorado.
Oh,
It's
Michael.
great to have you out.
It's good to see you.
You mentioned at part of your speech that you have a critique of the current administration, perhaps previous administrations, on showing this value, this religious freedom value, and the public as well. What actions would you advise our government and perhaps our population to take besides an attitude change in order to live out this idea of religious freedom and to help promote it throughout the world? What should we change about our policy or perhaps how we interact with the world in order to better display that?
Well, I think we have policies in place, but we're not very active in promoting them. For example, this Commission for International Religious Freedom that I was part of for a while is part of the statutory law of our country, and Tom can correct me on this. It's about to expire, and it's time for us to renew that. And whether or not we're going to renew it depends on whether we think it's a significant issue and whether we're going to fund it, and whether the State Department is going to take it seriously in the way it evaluates our relationship with other countries. We don't have an ambassador for religious freedom now. We haven't had one for 2 years. And it's a slowness to do things like that that indicates to me that this is, well, it's kind of a nice little thing on the side, it's something that conservatives are interested in. But I think it's a foundational issue for all of us. So I don't know that we have to rewrite anything that we don't already have, but we need to recommit ourselves to it and then invest in it appropriately, both in terms of authority and funding. But again, how many people here even know, maybe this group might, that we have a Commission for International Religious Freedom? Most people don't know it and really don't care much about that, I guess.
Georgetown 74. With respect to the Founding Fathers, do you see Spinoza in God and Nature with respect to Jefferson, and in Freemasonry with Washington and Franklin? Is Spinoza a Christian thinker?
No, and there were plenty of deists, among our framers and founders of the Constitution. They're not all Christians, but there are serious Christians, and certainly even the people who were Enlightenment people are sons, because there weren't many daughters, sons of Christian thought. That's where it came from. It was just important for us to acknowledge that. It just doesn't come out of the air. It came through a process that has its foundation in...
But in terms of freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of press, freedom of association, Spinoza wrote that in after, posthumously in the Theological Political Treatise, 100 years before the Revolution.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Do you recognize any influence?
I don't personally know.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Father Arnie Panula, the director of the Catholic Information Center here in Washington. Thank you, Archbishop, for your words.
Thank you, Father.
Pope Benedict XVI has spoken of the danger of the dictatorship of relativism. And certainly in higher education, we're seeing that it's not just a question of moral relativism, but really of intellectual relativism. Could you address that as being sort of one of the things which undermines the effort to espouse and to keep alive these foundational ideas that our founders had in mind?
Well, I think it's kind of obvious from where I've stood when I spoke that I think it's, skepticism and relativism is a dangerous kind of thing. Relativism, basically means that nothing has enduring value. It's all relative in terms of where we commonly desire to go or where we come from. And I think that religious freedom is based on the belief of man's intrinsic value. It's not a relative value, it's an intrinsic value. And that our freedom of conscience and our freedom of worship is intrinsically part of who we are. It's not something that's given to us by the crowd or by the government, which is what relativism is. You know, it is what the majority of us agree it is. So I think that relativism really does undermine the basic principles of what our Constitution is built on.
Excuse me.
Sorry. Over here. As Catherine Marshall said, these lights make it difficult to see people, so if I'm not acknowledging you, do something dramatic. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Zarina Shakir, and I'm producer and host of a television show called Perspectives of Interfaith. I'm African and Native American. And so my question is more basic and around the treaties that have been signed here in America, the founding fathers. I don't think they were founding for me, but who knows? My point would be around religion. I was born and raised as a Christian, but I am Muslim and have been for over 30 years. And my question has to do with how our religious freedoms and all that has gone on in this country for hundreds of years have not been addressed in the appropriate manner, particularly with the native peoples here and in other countries, where we tend to go and put our faiths or our religions either through missionaries or through doctrines or some way, but are not really followed through. What can you say about that, particularly as a Native American yourself?
Well, you know, I'm aware of human frailty because I look at myself. But, you know, the story of our human frailty goes back to the biblical story of Adam and Eve. You know, they messed it up from the beginning. So when the fact that our founders and framers messed it up a lot and didn't apply it evenly, you know, slavery, the way Native Americans, is not a source of scandal to me. It's a source of disappointment. And we need to correct the mistakes that we've made in the past. The fact that we have good principles doesn't mean we have all the principles, and it doesn't mean that we've applied them appropriately. You know, those of us who have a relationship with the Native American community know that in a special way. Those of you who come from backgrounds where there's slavery know that in a radical way. But none of that should, I think, not obvious from what I said, none of that should undermine our confidence that the principles are good. And we just need to be, we shouldn't become cynical or skeptical because of our failures. Our failures should lead us to be responsible about getting serious about it again, because cynicism, skepticism leads nowhere except to this kind of radical individualism and relativism, which I think is really dangerous. You know, I think that it's important for us to be able to talk honestly and clearly. I tried in my reflections to be just honest about what I think and not to couch it in politically correct terms. I don't think that really ever serves a purpose. But I welcome disagreement. I welcome dialogue. I think that's the best way our religious freedom is served, if we all can freely say what we believe religiously and then have the freedom then to live that way too. So thank you for your reflection. And the Native American community welcomes any attention at all because we get so little, right?
This gentleman.
Hi, my name is Amjad Chaudhary. I came from NIH, National Institute of Health. But I'm part of Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and that's where the question came from and comment. They, I think, in USA, we are very well, and we see all the religious freedom, and we can make progress in the USA, in Europe. But in many Muslim countries like Indonesia, like Pakistan, like some other countries, they are afraid of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community because we believe that second coming of Messiah had happened. And that's why they want to suppress us. In Indonesia, just 2 weeks ago, there was some people were killed from our community, and same thing happened in Pakistan also. And same thing happened to the Christians also. They are in Pakistan and Indonesia also. The thing is that the religious freedom we are talking about here, and we can see that it's here. But in Indonesia and Pakistan, we should be able to like spread the religious freedom. They are for a long time they have banned our literature. They have banned us to say anything to others, and these are the things those are going on. And I can see that religious freedom and these things we need to promote in those countries also. And that's what I'm saying, that maybe in our government or other people, you can do that, have some religious freedom there also. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. You know, I think that we need to be proud of our religious freedom in this country, and we need to propose it with confidence to the world. We can't impose it. It doesn't work if you impose it. But to be confident and then to propose it and make it an active part of our international relationships is a very important thing for our country to do. Otherwise, people like yourself are left hanging without the support of people who could reach out in support of you. So I think I found the panels fascinating today, and you know the Muslim panel especially, because it's the group that I'm least personally familiar with. But I think they're the ones who need to listen to what Americans say about religious freedom. They're the ones that help their own people understand how this might apply in a context of being faithful Muslims, and at the same time open to the possibility that this is a way you embrace human dignity. So the way we do it is very important, but the fact that we consistently and insistently do it is also very important. I'm not sure that we are committed to that as a country anymore.
Heidi Burns, Georgetown University. I would like to thank you for your very eloquent and very persuasive way of laying out a landscape that affirmed the Christian background of much of what is here, then an understanding of political life in general and religious life within it. But I'm wondering to what extent signal nouns like relativism or secularization are as helpful as I think we need the discussion to be with regard to the very persuasive anthropology that you laid out. Because it seems to me that it is not the case some of the key components of that anthropology that you laid out so well are not also shared in some of these other environments. And in fact, that it might be that the Christian environment in various places, including the United States, has in fact, through its own conduct, lost sight of some of these central anthropological features. And whether one wants to create a cause and effect relationship is another matter, but these things were picked up in other environments, in a secular environment, for instance, that affirmed certain things in a way that a Christian believer might consider to be somewhat out of balance, all the way to the place of unacceptable. But I think it would behoove us, I'm a practicing Catholic, and it would behoove us to consider the extent to which we ourselves have contributed to a needless creation of dichotomies and a needless creation of other alternatives outside what we would otherwise consider to be the high values of a Christian anthropology.
I agree with you.
And I think there would be consequences for leadership in the various faith traditions.
I agree with you. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have one here and one here. Whoever gets there first, the gentleman.
There's no reason for me to repeat something as she said more eloquently than I could, so that's the reason I said I agree with her. So,
I guess I'm first. I'm Richard Hyde. I'm a congregational minister.
Richard.
So you were here this morning, and one of the panelists this morning said that religious minorities could use Sharia law to appeal for tolerance and appeal to the tradition. So is your position that Sharia law is inherently intolerant, or is it just intolerant in practice the way our own legal system occasionally is?
I wouldn't be knowledgeable enough to make a judgment about its intrinsic value, but I just know that Christians who live in an environment where it's applied to them find it difficult, and that's all I was saying. So I think again it's very hard for me to be critical of a tradition I don't understand. It's better for me to maybe ask questions, but not to be. I can't make a judgment like that. I don't know. And I think that Muslims among themselves disagree on that, and they know a whole lot more about it than I do. So we ought to let Catholics decide what Catholics believe, and then Muslims believe what Muslims believe, and then listen to one another. I would like to say something about a panel this morning. One of the people in the Jewish panel said something very interesting about bishops telling politicians what to do, and they shouldn't do it. I think it's true, but I think bishops are uniquely qualified to tell Catholic politicians whether they're Catholic or not. It's not what they should do. And then I don't know any bishop who's telling politicians what to do, but there are bishops who tell people that what you're doing is not compatible with being Catholic. That's not the same thing. I mean, the Catholic community has a right to determine its own identity, and individual Catholics don't have a right to decide what the Catholic faith is. That's somewhat the community believes. And so just understand that when Catholic bishops say something, we're not telling politicians what to do. We're just saying what you're doing is not compatible with what it means to be Catholic, and I think that's appropriate. Sometimes it's more prudent to say it personally rather than publicly, but it's appropriate.
Faith McDonald from the Institute on Religion and Democracy. First of all, thank you so much for your work on the Commission on International Religious Freedom, for the kind of people you were talking about who have been persecuted and oppressed. My question has to do with, related to what you said about moral relativism. I'm always stymied in work on religious freedom issues, and especially on physical persecution or very overt persecution, that there's such a climate of moral equivalence. And it's very hard, I guess, in a climate of moral relativism to even have the idea that there's such a thing as evil anymore, or that at least there's such a thing as something that's totally wrong. And I wondered if you could just make a comment about how we can deal with moral equivalence when speaking out and being advocates for people who are persecuted.
Can you give me an example? I think you're probably talking about Sudan, probably. And why don't you just give it as an example so that it can be concrete rather than theoretical?
Okay, yeah, I would definitely be talking about Sudan in this case, and in terms of the way our government dealt with both sides of the Khartoum government versus the SPLA in that case through the years, and just using as a phrase that came off the tongue so glibly, there have been violations on both sides.
Exactly.
So, thank you.
That's right. And the way to deal with violations on both sides is to condemn violations on both sides and not to enter into that sphere of saying, well, in that context, in that context, it doesn't matter. And it really matters deeply if you believe in human dignity. So thank you for your own commitment and for articulating that.
I'd like to pick up, if I could, on something you said, Archbishop, about, I think answering the last question, that we don't impose religious freedom, but we propose it as a model for others. In your remarks, you talked about I think you said, it was a very nice phrase, in Iraq we went in with a Washington understanding of secularism or some such thing.
Right.
Could you expand a little bit on that, and perhaps, if it's useful, bring into the conversation you're about to head to Paris to speak to the French on various things.
I don't think I'm speaking to the French. I'm speaking to a small group of French people.
I think you need to speak to all the French. There's a difference between the French model of religious freedom and the American model, and I'm wondering if the Iraqis thought we were French.
Well, they have a lot of influence by France there. I think those of us who've worked in the area of the Commission for International Religious Freedom have been concerned that the people who do the diplomatic work for our country in the State Department often don't have an understanding how how strong religious faith and values can influence a people. So they miss that whole dimension when dealing with international problems. That, you know, they don't consider what deeply convinced Muslims are deeply convinced, and you can't dismiss that or put that in the background as though it's not very significant. And the French model of religious liberty that Tom's referring to, of course, is that you just keep religion out of the public sphere, and it rises out of those religious wars in Europe, I'm sure, where, you know, they just were tired of fighting with one another over religion, so they decided to bracket it, make it a matter of private life, have nothing to do with the public. But that doesn't work with religious people, and it didn't work in Iraq, and it can't work. One of the things that we need to admire about the Iraqi people, and so much of Islam today, is fervent religiosity. I mean, they really do believe. They submit themselves to God and their understanding of God's requirements of them. They do it deeply and profoundly. And if we don't understand that in our international dealings, we're going to have a disaster. And I think that was in some ways dismissed or not taken into account in Iraq. And our understanding is not the French understanding, although many of us kind of are moving that direction, you know, that religion is something for the private, not for the marketplace. It's something you do privately in your home. And, you know, all this business about taking away conscience rights that seem to be happening in our country, that's something for us to worry about, because religious freedom means I have a right to follow my conscience at work, you know, in business as well as in my home. And we're playing around with those issues in an inappropriate way, I think, in our own time.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, will you help me thank the Archbishop?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
for